But Amira tilted her head slightly. A small, subtle movement. Yet somehow, it shifted the entire power dynamic in the room. She wasn't afraid of him, and he knew it. "Was I?" she asked, her voice smooth as glass. The question landed like a hammer. Lancaster stilled, because the way she asked it, it wasn't defiant. It wasn't angry. It was calculated, precise, dangerous. She reached into her bag again. This time, every pair of eyes in the room followed her movement. The air was thick, suffocating. She pulled out a thin, neatly bound folder and placed it beside her bar card. "Your Honor," she said, sliding it forward, "this is the full transcript of the body cam footage from the officers who arrested me." A hush fell over the courtroom. The bailiff hesitated, then slowly picked up the folder and handed it to Lancaster. The judge snatched it from him, flipping it open. His eyes scanned the first few lines, and his jaw clenched, because right there in black and white, it proved exactly what Amira had just said. Amira's voice was steady, unwavering. "It clearly shows I asked one question." She tapped the folder lightly. "What's the charge?" A beat of silence. Then she continued. "That was the extent of my involvement. No threats, no obstruction, just a question." Another murmur rippled through the crowd. Even the prosecutor looked uneasy now. Amira folded her hands neatly in front of her, her gaze never leaving Lancaster's. "Your Honor, the Supreme Court has ruled that speech alone does not constitute obstruction unless it directly interferes with law enforcement actions." She let that sink in. Then, she struck the final blow. Asking a question is not a crime. Lancaster's fingers curled around the edge of the folder, his knuckles whitening. His gaze flicked up, furious, humiliated. His voice came out sharper now, the cracks in his confidence finally showing. "That's not for you to decide," he snapped. But Amira didn't even blink. She leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering just enough that everyone had to lean in to hear. "It already has been decided. Houston versus Hill, 1987. The Supreme Court held that individuals have the right to verbally challenge police officers without fear of arrest." She paused, letting her words sink in like a knife twisting deeper. "If you'd like," she continued, calmly, "I can cite additional cases where officers were found to have unlawfully detained civilians for simply speaking." The tension in the room cracked wide open. The prosecutor swallowed hard. The officers near the door shifted uneasily. The judge? For the first time in 3 decades, Raymond Lancaster had nothing to say. The tension in the room was suffocating. Judge Raymond Lancaster sat rigid in his chair, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the folder Amira had just placed before him. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with something almost electric. Everyone could feel it. Something was happening, something none of them had expected. Amira didn't gloat. She didn't smirk, didn't bask in the chaos she had just unleashed. She simply reached into her bag again. The entire room tensed. But this time when she pulled something out, it wasn't another credential. It wasn't another surprise. It was a thin folder. She placed it gently on the defense table. And then she slid it forward. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, unshaken. "This is the body cam transcript from the officers who arrested me." A sharp silence filled the room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the prosecutor, Richard Calloway, who had been scrambling through his notes moments ago, froze in place. The bailiff hesitated, unsure whether to take it. He glanced at Lancaster. The judge clenched his jaw but gave a tight nod. The bailiff picked up the folder, walked it to the bench, and placed it in front of Lancaster. The judge snatched it. His eyes scanned the first few lines. Then, his face changed. Amira's voice cut through the thick silence like a blade. "It clearly shows that I asked one question." She tapped the folder lightly, drawing every pair of eyes toward it. "What's the charge?" She let the words hang in the air. A long, unbearable pause followed. Then, she continued, "That was the extent of my involvement. No resistance, no obstruction, no threats, just a question." A ripple of murmurs broke out in the crowd. People began to lean forward, whispering in hushed tones. Even the officers near the door shifted uneasily. Lancaster stiffened. He knew where this was going. Amira had anticipated his response before he could even form it. So before he could open his mouth, she spoke first. Her voice clear, precise, and deliberate. Your Honor, the Supreme Court has already ruled on cases like this. Houston versus Hill, 1987. The court held that individuals have the right to verbally challenge police officers without fear of arrest. A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. Someone near the back audibly gasped. Calloway, the prosecutor, looked visibly pale. Even the bailiffs, who normally remained expressionless, exchanged uncertain glances. Amira continued. The Supreme Court made it clear, asking a question is not a crime. She let the words sink in, her gaze never wavering, and the entire courtroom felt it. Lancaster's fingers tightened around the edge of the folder, as though squeezing it might make the evidence disappear. His voice came out sharp, but there was something in it now, something that hadn't been there before. Doubt. That's not for you to decide, he snapped. But Amira was unfazed. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. It already has been decided, by the highest court in the country. Another stunned silence filled the room. The murmurs from the spectators grew louder, an undeniable energy of realization washing over them. For decades, Judge Lancaster had ruled this courtroom with absolute authority. He had seen thousands of cases, handed down countless sentences, controlled every outcome. But not today, because for the first time, he wasn't in control anymore. She was, and he knew it. The silence in the courtroom was no longer just tense. It was suffocating. Judge Lancaster sat rigid, his face locked in a tight mask of control. But it was slipping. Everyone could see it. And Amira Daniels wasn't done yet. She reached into her bag one last time. This time, what she pulled out wasn't a bar card, wasn't a body cam transcript. It was a thick stack of documents. She placed it firmly on the defense table. And then, she looked straight at Judge Lancaster. Your Honor, she said, her voice calm, controlled. I have been reviewing transcripts of your past rulings. A pause. Lancaster stilled. Something in his expression shifted, just for a moment. A flicker of realization. A flicker of fear. Amira flipped open the folder, running her fingers across the pages. Her voice was sharp, unwavering as she spoke. Over the past 10 years, Your Honor, your sentencing record shows a consistent pattern for defendants charged with the same offenses. She lifted a single sheet of paper, reading it out loud. Case number 3041, John Matthews, a 20-year-old white college student, arrested for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. A pause. Then, she turned the page. Case number 3042, Malik Carter, a 19-year-old black high school senior. Same charges, same circumstances. She held both pages up for the court to see. Then, she read the sentencing. John Matthews, charges dismissed. Youthful indiscretion. Malik Carter, 60 days in county jail. A low murmur spread through the courtroom. Someone near the back let out an audible scoff. The reporters' fingers flew across their keyboards, documenting every word. Amira flipped another page, then another, then another. Every single one told the same story. White defendant, probation. Black defendant, years in jail. White defendant, case dismissed. Black defendant, maximum sentence. The more she read, the more the courtroom shifted. People sat up straighter. Bailiffs glanced at each other. Even Calloway, the prosecutor, was visibly shaken. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about Amira anymore. This was about dozens, hundreds. This was a system, and Lancaster was at the center of it. Lancaster's jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might crack. His fingers dug into the edge of his bench. He wanted to slam the gavel, to end this now, but he couldn't, because the whole courtroom was watching, because the whole country was about to find out, because for the first time in his career, he was the one on trial. The prosecutor, Richard Calloway, was breathing heavily now. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him. He had worked with Lancaster for years, had tried hundreds of cases under his rulings. And suddenly, he was in the spotlight too. Because if he continued to prosecute Amira now, it wouldn't just be Lancaster under scrutiny. It would be him, the entire justice system. And he knew it. Amira closed the file with a deliberate motion. Then, She placed both hands on the defense table, leaning in slightly. Her voice dropped lower now, making everyone lean in to listen. Your Honor. She let the words sink in before continuing. Would you like to discuss the statistical breakdown of your sentencing disparities? The air was thick, stifling. Lancaster's eyes darted to the documents, to the journalists in the back, scribbling furiously, to Calloway, who was no longer looking at him. He knew what was coming next, and it was too late to stop it. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Lancaster sat frozen, his grip tightening around the gavel as if holding onto the last shred of his power. But it was slipping, and he could feel it. Amira Daniels stood tall, unwavering, her stack of evidence still lying in plain view for everyone to see. Then, the moment that changed everything. Richard Calloway, the prosecutor, had been silent for too long, his face pale, his fingers twitching against the papers in front of him. For years, he had stood on this very side of the courtroom, trusting Lancaster's rulings without question. But now he was trapped. If he continued to prosecute this case, he would be seen as complicit, a defender of injustice, a part of the problem, and he knew exactly what that meant. His career, his reputation, his name, all of it would go down with Lancaster. So with one slow, deep breath, he straightened in his seat. Then he spoke. Your Honor. His voice cracked slightly. Lancaster's eyes snapped to him, sharp, desperate. The whole courtroom leaned in, waiting. Calloway swallowed hard. Then, with the weight of every journalist's pen, every camera lens, every spectator's eyes pressing down on him, he said, the prosecution withdraws all charges. Gasps, murmurs. The sound erupted like a wave, sweeping across the gallery as people whispered, pointed, stared. A journalist fumbled for their phone. A woman in the back covered her mouth with both hands. Even the bailiffs, usually silent and emotionless, glanced at each other. But the loudest reaction came from Judge Lancaster. What? Lancaster's voice was sharp, disbelieving. His gavel slammed against the wood, his face burning with rage, humiliation, and something else, panic. Calloway, you can't be serious, he barked. The prosecutor didn't look at him, didn't even flinch, because Lancaster was no longer the most powerful man in the room. Amira Daniels was. The young attorney took a slow step forward, her hands still resting lightly on the defense table. She wasn't smug. She wasn't gloating. She was delivering the final blow. Your Honor, she said smoothly, her voice cutting through the chaos like a razor. Then, she reached down and lifted one final document into the air. A single-page formal complaint. The courtroom fell into silence once again. Amira turned toward the journalists in the back, making sure they could see it clearly. This, she said, her voice unwavering, is an official complaint filed with the Judicial Conduct Board. Lancaster's face drained of color. Multiple attorneys have already submitted evidence of racial bias in your rulings, Amira continued. This case, my case, was flagged as part of that investigation. Lancaster's fingers twitched against his gavel, but he didn't strike it, because he knew what this meant. Public scrutiny, formal hearings, disbarment. The reporters were already typing furiously. The cameras in the courtroom clicked like gunfire, capturing every second. And then, the doors to the courtroom swung open. Two uniformed officials stepped inside, their presence alone sending another shockwave through the room. Court officers from a state commission on judicial conduct. One of them, a tall, gray-haired man in a crisp suit, cleared his throat and spoke. His voice boomed over the chaos. Judge Raymond Lancaster, due to ongoing investigations into multiple judicial complaints, you are hereby placed on immediate suspension. A wave of noise crashed through the room. Cheers, gasps, the rapid-fire clicking of journalist cameras capturing the fall of a man who once thought himself untouchable. But Lancaster, he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe. For 3 full seconds, he sat there, a man who had spent 3 decades controlling other people's fates, watching his own slip away. Amira gathered her documents with slow precision. She slid them neatly into her bag, and as she walked past Lancaster, She stopped, just for a moment. Her voice was quiet, but sharp as steel. Looks like the law finally caught up with you. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Judge Raymond Lancaster sitting alone, powerless, in the courtroom he once ruled. By the time Amira stepped out of the courthouse, the world already knew what had happened. The air was thick with energy, the murmurs of onlookers growing louder. Then, the first news alert popped up on a journalist's phone, and then another, and another. Within minutes, the headlines were everywhere. Racist judge exposed an explosive courtroom showdown. 19-year-old lawyer brings down corrupt judge in shocking legal battle. Justice served. The fall of Judge Lancaster. News stations scrambled to cover the story. Social media exploded. Videos of the courtroom exchange went viral. Millions of views within hours. People weren't just watching. They were talking. And for the first time, people who had once felt powerless saw what justice could look like. Across the country, people began speaking up. Families of defendants who had stood before Lancaster came forward, sharing their own stories of harsh sentences, unfair rulings, shattered lives. He gave my brother 10 years for a first offense. My son was just a kid. Lancaster sent him away like he was nothing. He ruined lives, and he never even blinked. Now, those voices were no longer whispers. They were a movement, and at the center of it was Amira Daniels. Amira stood at the base of the courthouse steps, the flashing lights of cameras illuminating her face. A reporter pushed forward. "Miss Daniels, did you expect this outcome today?" She took a breath, steadying herself. "Justice always catches up to those who think they're untouchable," she said. The reporters leaned in. She wasn't done. "But this is not the end. This is just the beginning." As the press swarmed, Amira felt a sharp vibration in her pocket. Her phone, a new message. She pulled it out, expecting a text from a friend, a colleague. But instead, it was from an unknown number. "We need to talk. I have something you'll want to see." A chill ran down her spine. She lifted her gaze, scanning the crowd. Was someone watching her? Had this battle only just begun? The cameras continued to flash. Reporters continued to shout questions. But Amira wasn't listening anymore. She turned slightly, facing the massive courthouse behind her. It loomed tall and unshaken. But so did she. Her eyes were sharp, determined, unyielding. She had won this fight, but she knew the war was far from over. She tucked her phone away, squared her shoulders, and walked forward, because what came next will be even bigger. The echoes of the courtroom battle lingered far beyond the walls of that courthouse. It was more than just a case, more than just one corrupt judge falling from power. It was a reminder, a loud, undeniable reminder, that justice does not belong to the powerful, that the law is not a weapon for the privileged to wield, and that change doesn't come from those who sit in high places. It comes from those who dare to challenge them, from those who refuse to be silent, from those who know their rights and aren't afraid to fight for them. Amira Daniels was only 19 years old. 19, and yet she had done what no one else had dared to do for decades. She had stood before a man who had destroyed lives, and she had made him answer for it. She had proven that knowledge is power, that fearlessness is a weapon, and that sometimes the biggest revolutions start with a single voice saying no. This wasn't just a story about a courtroom showdown. This was about something much bigger. It was about every person who had ever stood in front of a judge like Lancaster, feeling helpless, small, unheard. It was about the ones who never got a second chance, the ones who had lost everything because of a system that wasn't built to protect them. And now, for the first time, that system was cracking, because people were finally paying attention, people were finally asking questions, and people were finally demanding answers. As Amira walked away from the courthouse that day, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end, not even close, because for every Judge Lancaster who falls, there are still dozens more who remain. And for every injustice that gets exposed, there are still countless others hidden in the shadows. But now, people knew what to look for. They knew how to fight back. And most importantly, they knew who to stand behind. This isn't just a story. This is a wake-up call to everyone who has ever doubted their own power, To everyone who has ever thought change was impossible, and to everyone who has ever been told to stay silent, the fight for justice never ends. But it always begins with someone brave enough to say, "No more." If this story made you think, don't just scroll away. Take action. Like this video to help spread awareness. Share it with your friends and family, because conversations spark change. Comment below and tell us your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power? Let's talk about it. Follow our channel for more powerful real-life stories. And turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Change starts with awareness. Awareness starts with you. Be part of the movement. The courtroom had its own rhythm. A steady hum of rustling papers, the occasional cough, murmured conversations between attorneys fine-tuning their arguments before the judge arrived. But today, something was different. The air felt heavier, charged with an unspoken tension that made even the walls seem to lean in, waiting for what was about to unfold. At the center of it all sat Judge Raymond Lancaster. Perched high above the room, he looked like an unshakable oak, aged, solid, immovable. He had ruled this courtroom for 3 decades, his presence deeply embedded in the very wood of the judge's bench, just as much as in the lives of those who stood before him. His reputation preceded him, strict, unwavering, predictable. To him, justice was not about fairness but order, and order meant control. He didn't like disruptions. He didn't like surprises. He especially didn't like people who challenged the way things had always been, which was why, when 19-year-old Amira Daniels walked into his courtroom that day, wearing a simple blouse and a pair of worn jeans, he barely looked up from the case file in front of him. Another young black woman wasting the court's time. Lancaster already knew how this was going to end, because he had seen it 100 times before. The judge exhaled slowly, adjusting his glasses with the tip of his finger. "Miss Daniels," he drawled, dragging her name out as if saying it was an inconvenience. Amira didn't react. She stood with her hands calmly folded in front of her, watching, listening, waiting. Lancaster continued, flipping through the file in front of him with lazy disinterest. "I see here that you were arrested for interfering with police business, resisting arrest." He waved a dismissive hand at the prosecutor, as if the details didn't matter. A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom, quiet but unmistakable. Near the door, 2 uniformed officers stood with their arms crossed, smug expressions plastered on their faces. The prosecutor, Richard Calloway, barely even looked up from his notes. It was a script they had seen play out before. Another defendant, another routine ruling. Lancaster shook his head. "Frankly, it doesn't matter. You were told to move, and you didn't. That's a problem." The laughter in the room grew just a little louder. Amira remained silent, still watching, still waiting. Lancaster tilted his head slightly, finally looking at her properly for the first time. She wasn't speaking. She wasn't interrupting. She wasn't pleading. And that bothered him. He tapped his fingers against the bench impatiently. "Miss Daniels," he said again, his voice sharper this time. "Do you think this is a joke?" Finally, Amira spoke. "No, Your Honor." Her voice was calm, even unshaken. Lancaster narrowed his eyes. He didn't like her tone. Too confident, too sure. "Then I suggest," he continued, leaning forward slightly, "you show some respect for this court and take responsibility for your actions." His voice carried the weight of someone who had sentenced thousands before her, someone used to absolute obedience. But Amira didn't react the way he expected. She didn't shrink. She didn't break. Instead, she simply inhaled slowly, steeling herself. Lancaster scoffed. "Maybe if you paid more attention in school, you wouldn't be standing here today." And just like that, the entire room shifted. The snickering stopped. The murmurs died down. Even the prosecutor glanced up from his papers, suddenly interested in where this was going. But Amira? She didn't flinch. Instead, she slipped one hand casually into her bag. The bailiffs took a cautious step forward, sensing movement. Lancaster rolled his eyes, already preparing to dismiss whatever pathetic excuse she was about to make. But then, she pulled out a sleek black leather case. And when she flipped it open and placed it on the defense table, the entire courtroom froze. Because inside the case, lying in plain sight for everyone to see, was a bar card. Shiny, polished, unmistakable. The kind of credential that only licensed attorneys carried. The kind of credential that should have been impossible for a 19-year-old to have. Amira placed it neatly on the table. Then, with a single measure motion, she tapped her finger lightly against the card. She looked directly at Lancaster and said, "Your Honor, I did pay attention in school." The silence in the room stretched so thick, it was suffocating. The judge's smirk vanished. The prosecutor sat up straighter, flipping through his files frantically. The officers near the door exchanged nervous glances. Because in that moment, the game had changed, and Judge Raymond Lancaster, he was no longer in control. Judge Raymond Lancaster didn't even bother to lift his gaze when Amira Daniels stood before him. To him, she was just another troublemaker, another young black teenager with an attitude problem, standing before his bench wasting the court's time. He had seen this before, or so he thought. With a slow exhale, he flipped through the case file, his fingers drumming lazily against the bench as he skimmed the words without interest. "Miss Daniels," he finally muttered, dragging her name out like it was something unpleasant on his tongue. Amira stood still. She didn't react, but that only seemed to annoy him further. Lancaster adjusted his glasses and read from the report, his tone flat, almost bored. Interfering with police business. Resisting arrest. A slight smirk curled at the corner of his mouth as he shook his head. Same story, different day. He barely spared a glance at Richard Calloway, the prosecutor, who was half-heartedly flipping through his own notes. Frankly, Lancaster continued, waving a dismissive hand, "It doesn't really matter. You were given a lawful order, and you refused. That's a problem." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the room, low, cruel, knowing. Over by the entrance, the two officers who had arrested her stood with their arms crossed, smug grins on their faces. Even Calloway, who had been distracted, let out a quiet exhale that almost sounded like a suppressed laugh. This wasn't a trial. It was a script, one they had all seen before. And the ending? Lancaster thought he already knew. Lancaster tilted his head, finally looking up from the paperwork. For the first time, he really saw her. A young black woman in worn jeans and a plain blouse, standing there with an expression too calm, too still. Something about her silence made his fingers tighten around the gavel. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't pleading, and he didn't like that. Not at all. Lancaster let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Miss Daniels," he repeated, this time with an edge of mockery in his voice. "Do you even understand where you are?" Still, Amira said nothing. That irritated him. No smart remarks? No excuses, he taunted. Nothing. Lancaster leaned forward slightly, his tone turning colder. "Let me guess," he mused. "You think you don't belong here?" The question hung in the air, but Amira didn't respond. Lancaster sighed, shaking his head again. "Maybe if you'd spent more time paying attention in school, you wouldn't be standing here today." And just like that, the entire courtroom shifted. The laughter stopped. The whispers faded. Even Calloway's pen, which had been idly tapping against the desk, froze mid-motion. There was a moment of silence, a quiet so thick it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. And then, Amira moved. She reached into her bag, her movements slow, deliberate. The two bailiffs took a step forward, sensing movement, their hands hovering near their belts. Lancaster rolled his eyes, already prepared to dismiss whatever pathetic excuse she was about to give. But when she pulled out the sleek, black leather case and placed it on the table, everything stopped, because inside, lying there in plain sight for everyone to see, was a bar card. Shiny, polished, unmistakable. A credential that only licensed attorneys carried. A credential that should have been impossible for a 19-year-old to have. The entire room froze. The prosecutor sat up straighter. The officers near the door exchanged uneasy glances. Lancaster's smirk vanished. For the first time, he didn't know how this was going to end. And that changed everything. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Judge Lancaster sat perched high above, his gavel resting loosely in his grip, his face still twisted in the same smug, dismissive expression. He had expected defiance from the young woman standing before him. He had expected pleas, excuses, maybe even anger. What he hadn't expected was silence. Cold, steady, unshaken. Amira Daniels didn't beg. She didn't argue. She simply reached into her bag. The motion was slow, deliberate, and it made the bailiffs tense immediately. Two uniformed officers shifted near the door, their hands instinctively hovering close to their belts. Lancaster let out a sharp exhale, rolling his eyes. "Here we go," he muttered under his breath, already preparing to dismiss whatever pathetic excuse she was about to give. But then, she pulled out a sleek, black leather case and placed it on the defense table. A small, precise click echoed in the silent courtroom as she flipped it open. Inside, lying on the polished wood, was a bar card. Shiny, official, unmistakable. A credential that only licensed attorneys carried. A credential that should have been impossible for a 19-year-old to have. For 3 full seconds, the entire courtroom was frozen in absolute silence. Then chaos. A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery, growing louder with every second. The prosecutor, Richard Calloway, sat up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. His eyes darted to the card, then to Amira, then back to the card. The officers near the door exchanged glances, their once smug expressions fading into unease. Even the bailiffs, usually still as statues, shifted uncomfortably. But the real reaction? Judge Raymond Lancaster. The judge, who moments ago had been so sure, so comfortable in his power, suddenly looked lost. His smirk had disappeared. His fingers tightened slightly around his gavel. And for the first time, he didn't have anything to say. Amira finally broke the silence. Her voice was clear, calm, and deliberate. The kind of voice that didn't just demand attention, but commanded it. "Your Honor, I did pay attention in school." Lancaster's eyes snapped back to hers, his jaw tightening. "She wasn't done. I graduated law school at 18. Passed the bar on my first attempt. And I'm here today, not as a defendant, but as an undercover investigator for a judicial watchdog organization." A bomb had just gone off in the middle of the courtroom. Lancaster blinked twice, as if he had misheard. Then he let out a short, hollow laugh, a sound with no real humor in it. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "A stunt. A lie. It had to be." He turned sharply toward Calloway. "Is there any record of this woman being a member of the bar?" he demanded. The prosecutor was already typing furiously, his fingers flying across the keyboard, his expression growing more and more tense with every passing second. The color in his face was slowly draining. I don't know. Your Honor," he admitted. Lancaster's lips pressed into a thin line. He turned back to Amira, his irritation flaring into frustration. "So what?" he snapped. "You think this changes anything? You still interfered with an arrest.